What if I told you that one city has been invaded, burned, rebuilt, conquered, and reborn so many times that its very streets are a graveyard, layer upon layer of empire, blood, and ambition stacked beneath your feet? What if I told you that the same ground where tourists stroll through quaint medieval walls today was once the nerve center of the entire Roman North, a city that emperors walked, that Vikings renamed, that Normans fortified, and that Georgian aristocrats tried to make fashionable? That city is York, and its story is not a polite English history lesson. It is 2,000 years of relentless, brutal, magnificent human drama, and almost nobody tells it the way it deserves to be told. Welcome to History and Mystery. I'm taking you on the full journey. The Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, the medieval lords, the Tudor intriguers, the Georgian sophisticates, the Victorian industrialists, and the York that exists right now, carrying all of it on its ancient shoulders. This is the entire history of York, and if you've never subscribed to this channel, now is the time, because we are just getting started. Let's begin where York begins, not with kings or cathedrals, but with legions. The year is 71 AD. The Roman Empire is at the height of its confidence. Vespasian sits on the throne in Rome, and his generals are pushing north through Britannia, a province they've held for barely 3 decades and still don't fully control. The north is trouble. The Brigantes, a powerful Celtic tribal confederation, have been a source of constant tension, and Rome has had enough. The 9th Legion, one of Rome's most battle-hardened military units, marches into the Vale of York. They find a tongue of land sitting between 2 rivers, the Ouse and the Foss, and they make a decision that will echo for 2,000 years. They build a fortress here. They call it Eboracum. Now, the name Eboracum is almost certainly derived from a Brittonic Celtic word, probably something meaning place of the yew trees, or possibly connected to a personal name. The Romans, as they always did, took a local word and Latinized it. That habit of borrowing and transforming names is one of the most interesting threads you can trace through York's entire history, because every conqueror renamed this place, and each new name is a clue to who they were and what they valued. But back to 71 AD, the fortress the Romans built was massive by any standard, covering roughly 50 acres, designed to hold around 5,000 soldiers. It was a standard Roman legionary fortress layout, rectangular, surrounded by a defensive ditch and rampart, with a grid of internal streets, barracks blocks, granaries, a headquarters building, a hospital, and a commander's house grand enough to be called a palace. The fortress sat on the north bank of the Ouse. Almost immediately, a civilian settlement, what the Romans called a canopy, began to grow up around it on the south bank. Merchants, craftsmen, families of soldiers, traders from across the empire, they all arrived. And within decades, Eboracum was a bustling, cosmopolitan place unlike anything else in northern Britain. And here's something that doesn't get said nearly enough about Roman York. This was not some remote frontier outpost. This was one of the most strategically important cities in the entire Western Roman Empire. Think about what that means. When you walk through York today, you're walking through a place that Roman emperors chose as their base of operations. Not London, which the Romans called Londinium and which was the commercial capital of Britannia. York, because York was where you staged your campaigns into Scotland. York was where you commanded the north. York was the military heart of Roman Britain. And emperors came here, not just governors, not just generals, emperors. The Emperor Hadrian visited Eboracum around 122 AD during his famous tour of the northern frontier. This is the same Hadrian who ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall, the Great Barrier stretching coast to coast across northern England that still stands today. Eboracum was his base, his headquarters, his command center. Then in 193 AD, something happened that changed the city's status entirely. Septimius Severus, the African-born general who had just fought his way to power after a brutal civil war, chose Eboracum as his imperial seat. He made it, for all practical purposes, the capital of the Roman Empire. Let that sink in, an emperor born in what is now Libya, ruling from what is now a northern English city, commanding an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. Rome itself was far away. York was where the action was. Severus didn't just use Eboracum as a military base. He transformed it. He upgraded the fortress, built new civic buildings, expanded the civilian settlement across the river, elevating it to the status of a colonia, the highest rank a Roman provincial city could achieve. Eboracum became Colonia Eboracensis, a city with full Roman civic rights, a city that could stand alongside the great cities of the empire. And Severus died here, in 211 AD, after years of campaigning in Scotland, brutal campaigns that ancient sources describe as devastatingly violent. The emperor fell ill and died in Eboracum. His two sons, Caracalla and Geta, who despised each other, rushed back to Rome to fight over the throne. But their father's death in York gives this city a claim that very few places on earth can make. An emperor of Rome breathed his last here. But the most extraordinary imperial moment in York's history came nearly a century later. In 306 AD, another emperor died in the city. His name was Constantius I, and he too had made Eboracum his base for a campaign in the north. When he died, his troops did something that would change the entire course of Western civilization. They proclaimed his son emperor. Right here in Eboracum, in the year 306 AD, a young man named Constantine was lifted on a shield by his soldiers and hailed as Augustus, Emperor of Rome. Constantine, the man who would go on to become Constantine the Great, the emperor who converted to Christianity, the emperor who made Christianity the dominant religion of the Roman Empire and, by extension, of the Western world. The man who changed the entire spiritual and cultural trajectory of Europe, not just Europe, but global civilization, was proclaimed emperor in York. If you ever visit York and you see the statue of Constantine outside the Minster, a striking, brooding bronze figure seated on a throne, that is what it commemorates. The moment the future of the Western world turned on a hinge in a northern English city. Roman York continued to thrive through the 4th century, though the empire itself was increasingly strained. The legions were pulled away to deal with crises elsewhere. Barbarian pressure on the Rhine and Danube frontiers never let up. The money that had once funded grand civic buildings dried up. By around 410 AD, when the Emperor Honorius famously, and probably apocryphally, told the cities of Britain to look to their own defense, Roman administration in Britannia was effectively over. The legions left, the bureaucrats left. The long supply chains that had kept a Mediterranean-style urban economy functioning in northern Britain collapsed. And Eboracum, the city that had hosted emperors, that had been a colonia, that had been one of the most significant cities in the Western Roman Empire, faced the question that every great city faces when its civilization retreats. What happens next? What happened next was not immediate collapse. The city didn't empty overnight. People stayed. Structures remained. The great stone walls, some of which still partly define York's perimeter today, didn't crumble immediately. But the world that had built them was gone, and what came next was something entirely different. After the Romans, the story of York enters one of the most misunderstood periods in British history, a period we often call the Dark Ages, though historians today strongly resist that label. The centuries between roughly 400 and 700 AD were not dark. They were turbulent, yes, they were transformative, but in the shadows of that transformation, York was very much alive. As Roman administration collapsed in the early 5th century, the power vacuum in Britain was filled by a mixture of surviving Romano-British leaders, incoming Germanic settlers, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and the gradual, complicated process of cultural and political reorganization that would eventually produce what we call England. York sat at the heart of this process. The city that had been Eboracum became known, in the language of the incoming Anglian settlers, as Eboracum. The name is interesting. It's thought to derive from a misunderstanding or reinterpretation of the old Celtic and Latin forms, transformed through Anglian phonetics into something that sounded, to their ears, like Boer settlement, Eofor being the Old English word for Boer. By the early 7th century, Eboracum had become the capital of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, a powerful realm that at its height stretched from the Humber estuary in the south all the way to the Firth of Forth in what is now Scotland. And then came one of the most pivotal moments in the city's history, one that would define its spiritual identity for the next 14 centuries and counting. In 625 AD, a Roman monk named Paulinus arrived in Northumbria. He had come as chaplain to a Kentish princess, Ethelberg, who was to marry the Northumbrian King Edwin. Paulinus had an additional mission, to convert the northern English to Christianity. King Edwin was not immediately convinced. He was a cautious, thoughtful ruler who consulted his advisors, debated the merits of the new faith, and according to the great historian Bede, writing a century later, called a council where one of his pagan priests delivered one of the most beautiful and haunting speeches in early English literature. Life, the priest said, is like a sparrow flying through a lit mead hall on a winter night. For a moment it's in the warmth and light, and then it flies back into the darkness from which it came. If this new teaching can tell us anything certain about what lies beyond that darkness, let us follow it. In 627 AD, King Edwin was baptized. The location was a small wooden church, hastily constructed for the occasion on the site where York Minster stands today. That church was the seat of what would become one of the greatest cathedrals in the world. and the See of York, the ecclesiastical province established in the aftermath of Edwin's baptism, became one of the two great archbishoprics of England, second only to Canterbury. The Archbishop of York, to this day, holds the title Primate of England, one of the most senior positions in the Church of England. Edwin himself didn't last long. He was killed in battle in 633 AD by the pagan Mercian King Penda and his Welsh allies. Northumbria plunged into chaos, briefly returned to paganism, and then, after a series of battles and political upheavals, was reunited under a new Christian king, Oswald, who brought Irish missionaries from the monastery of Iona to help reconvert his people. The 7th and 8th centuries were, despite the political instability, a remarkable period for Northumbrian culture. The kingdom produced some of the finest art and scholarship in early medieval Europe. The Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the supreme masterpieces of insular art, were created on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast. The Venerable Bede, writing from his monastery at Jarrow, produced the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a work so foundational that he is considered the father of English history. Alcuin of York, the great scholar who would later become one of the chief architects of the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, was educated in York and ran the cathedral school there. York's cathedral school was in the 8th century, one of the finest centers of learning in Europe. Alcuin described its library as containing works of philosophy, history, natural science, rhetoric, mathematics, and theology, a collection that would be remarkable by any standard. York was not on the margins of European intellectual life, it was at its center. And then in 866 AD, everything changed again. The Vikings were coming. Now, before we continue, I need you to do something that truly helps our channel grow. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take a moment to do so, and while you're here, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Who knows, your city or country might inspire one of our next videos. The year 793 AD is the date most people associate with the Viking Age in Britain. That was when Norse raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne, the holy island of Northumbria, and shocked the Christian world with their violence. But 793 was only the beginning. For decades, Viking raids hit the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and France, lightning strikes, in and out, taking treasure, slaves, and livestock before anyone could mount an effective response. But by the 860s, something had changed. The raids were no longer hit-and-run operations. A massive force, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, and it wasn't raiding, it was conquering. The Great Heathen Army moved north. In November 866 AD, some sources say it was All Saints' Day, a supremely ironic timing. The Vikings attacked Eboracum. The city was divided at the time, with two rival Northumbrian kings fighting each other. They put aside their differences, briefly united, counterattacked, and were decisively defeated. Both kings were killed. Eboracum fell. The Vikings renamed it. Eboracum became Jorvik, a name that preserves the Norse pronunciation of the older Anglian form, and which, over centuries of phonetic drift, would eventually become York. Under Viking rule, Jorvik became something astonishing, and this is one of the most important corrections that modern archaeology has made to the old narrative of this period. The Vikings were not just raiders. In Jorvik, they were builders, traders, craftsmen, administrators, the creators of one of the most dynamic commercial cities in northern Europe. We know this with exceptional detail because of what happened when archaeologists excavated a site called Coppergate in York between 1976 and 1981. What they found was extraordinary, a slice of Viking-age York so well preserved, thanks to the waterlogged, oxygen-poor soil, that organic materials that normally rot away over centuries had survived intact. Wood, leather, cloth, food remains, even human excrement, all preserved, all yielding information about daily life in 10th century Jorvik. The picture that emerged was of a city of perhaps 10,000 people, huge by the standards of the time. Jorvik was a major hub of the North Sea trading network, connected by sea routes to Scandinavia, Iceland, the Baltic, Ireland, and the Frankish territories of northern Europe. Merchants brought in silk from Central Asia, yes, silk in 10th century York, amber from the Baltic, wine from the Rhineland, silver from the Arab world. Craftsmen in Jorvik produced high-quality metalwork, leather goods, textiles, and carved antler objects that were traded across the Viking world. The street names of modern York are still largely the street names the Vikings gave them. Gudrumgate, Gillagate, Miklagate, Stonegate. The suffix gate comes from the Old Norse word gata, meaning street or way. Coppergate itself means Street of the Cup Makers, a direct reference to the craftsmen who worked there. Shambles, York's famous medieval street, may derive from an Old Norse word for a market stall. Walk through York today, and you are walking through a Viking naming system preserved in amber for 1,000 years. Politically, Jorvik became the capital of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, a realm that the Norse kings held, lost, retook, and fought over repeatedly through the late 9th and early 10th centuries. The great Danish king Guthrum established a political settlement with the Anglo-Saxon king Alfred the Great in 878 AD that divided England along a diagonal boundary, the Danelaw, with York firmly on the Viking side of the line. Alfred spent his reign building a unified English kingdom, and his son and grandchildren continued the project after his death. His son Edward the Elder and his daughter Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, systematically reconquered the Danelaw in the early 10th century. Jorvik remained in Viking hands longer than most, but in 927 AD, Alfred's grandson Ethelstan took the city and briefly made himself, for the first time in history, king of all England. That unity didn't hold. Viking kings retook Jorvik more than once in the following decades, including the memorable reign of Erik Bloodaxe, the exiled Norwegian king who ruled Jorvik twice and was finally killed in 954 AD at the Battle of Stainmore. With his death, Viking rule in Jorvik ended permanently. Or so it seemed, because half a century later, one more Scandinavian invasion would rock England to its foundations, though that story belongs to the next chapter. The legacy of Viking York, though, is immense and lasting, not just the street names, not just the archaeological riches now displayed at the Jorvik Viking Center, but the very genetic and cultural fabric of the region. Studies of surnames, dialect words, and DNA have all shown that the Norse influence in Yorkshire is deep and enduring. The flat Yorkshire vowels, the directness of speech, certain turns of phrase, historians and linguists trace threads back to the Norse settlers of Jorvik. And there's another legacy that's easy to overlook. The Vikings, whatever their reputation as destroyers, also built and sustained the trading networks that made York economically significant for centuries afterward. When the Normans arrived in 1066, they found a wealthy, commercially sophisticated city, and that wealth had deep Viking roots. 1066, one of the most famous dates in English history, and for York, it was a date that arrived with particular violence. The Norman conquest of England is usually told as a story about the South, Hastings, Harold's death, William's march on London, his Christmas coronation in Westminster Abbey, but the North tells a different story, and it's a darker one. In September 1066, before William even landed on the English coast, a Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada invaded northern England with a massive fleet, allied with the English King Harold's own brother Tostig. Harald Hardrada, who was, in a very real sense, the last great Viking king, claimed the throne of England and marched south toward York. At the Battle of Gate Fulford, just south of York, on September 20, 1066, the northern English earls Edwin and Morcar met the Norse invaders. They were defeated. York capitulated. For 5 days, York was in Viking hands again. And Harold Godwinson, the English king who had just been holding the south coast against the expected Norman invasion, performed one of the most astonishing military feats of the medieval age. He marched his army north at extraordinary speed, covered roughly 185 miles in 4 days, and on September 25th, just 5 days after Gate Fulford, destroyed the Norse army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, just east of York. Harald Hardrada and Tostig were both killed. The Viking Age in England was definitively over. Harold had no time to celebrate. 3 days later, William of Normandy landed in the south. Harold marched south again at the same brutal pace. He was killed at Hastings on October 14th, and England had a new king, one who would prove to be among the most ruthless rulers the island had ever seen. William moved quickly to consolidate his hold on England, but the north was a problem. The Northumbrians had never entirely accepted Norman rule, and they showed it repeatedly. In 1068, there was a rebellion. William marched north, built 2 castles in York on either side of the Ouse to dominate the city. Those castles became Clifford's Tower and the structure opposite it, now the York Castle Museum. In 1069, the rebellion exploded. A Danish fleet arrived in the Humber, yes, more Scandinavians, and allied with the English rebels. The Norman garrison in York was massacred. William's response was immediate, total, and terrifying. What followed is known in history as the Harrying of the North, and it was one of the most deliberate and systematic acts of mass destruction ever carried out on English soil. William personally led his army north in the winter of 1069 to 1070 in conditions of brutal cold. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he destroyed everything. Crops were burned, livestock was slaughtered, villages were razed, food stores were torched. The entire economic infrastructure of northern England, from the Humber to the Tees, was systematically obliterated. The medieval chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing a generation later, described the aftermath with horror. So great a famine prevailed that men, compelled by hunger, devoured human flesh, than that of horses, dogs, and cats in whatever custom abhors. He estimated that over 100,000 people died from violence, starvation, and the exposure that followed the destruction of their shelter and food supply. Even the Domesday Book, compiled 16 years later, records huge swaths of Yorkshire as waste, land with no recorded population, no agricultural value, nothing. The harrying of the north depopulated and impoverished an entire region so completely that it took generations to recover. York itself survived. William needed it as an administrative center, but its surrounding landscape was devastated. The city that emerged from the Norman period was fundamentally transformed. Its English aristocracy replaced by Norman lords, its institutions reshaped by Norman administration, its skyline dominated by the two castles William had built to remind everyone who was in charge. The Normans built in stone, and they built to last. York Minster, which would eventually become the greatest Gothic cathedral in northern Europe, had its origins in this period, as Norman archbishops replaced the earlier Anglo-Saxon church structures with something grander and more permanent. The language of the city changed too. Norman French became the language of the court, the law, the church. Old English survived among the population, mixing slowly with French to create the hybrid that would eventually become Middle English, the language of Chaucer, of the medieval mystery plays, of the documents that let us peer into the lives of ordinary medieval people with increasing detail. The Normans gave York its administrative shape, its castle system, its ecclesiastical hierarchy in its mature form. They were brutal conquerors, but they were also organizers, builders, and, in their own fierce way, makers of the city that would flower in the medieval period to come. If you had stood in York in the year 1300 and looked around you, you would have seen a city at the peak of its medieval glory, and it would have taken your breath away. The towers of York Minster rising above the rooftops, the great circuit of city walls, much of what still stands today, running for nearly 3 miles around the city, punctuated by 4 great gateways called bars, Micklegate Bar, Bootham Bar, Monk Bar, and Walmgate Bar. The streets packed with merchants, craftsmen, pilgrims, clergy, beggars, students, and the perpetual noise of a medieval commercial city in full operation. Medieval York was the second city of England. After London, it was the most important place in the kingdom, a commercial powerhouse, a religious center of national significance, a hub of royal administration, and the seat of one of only 2 archbishops in the entire English church. The economic engine of medieval York was wool. Yorkshire wool was famous across Europe. English wool in general was among the most prized raw material on the continent, and York was the main marketing center for the trade from the entire north of England. Flemish merchants, Italian bankers, merchants from the Hanseatic League, all came to York for wool. The city's merchant class grew wealthy beyond anything their Viking Age predecessors could have imagined, and they spent that wealth building the city into something magnificent. The guilds of medieval York were powerful institutions. The merchant guilds controlled trade. The craft guilds, carpenters, tanners, cordwainers, goldsmiths, butchers, regulated their respective trades, set standards, trained apprentices, and accumulated enough wealth and civic power to be major players in city politics. Guild halls were built. Guild chapels were endowed. The social organization of the city was essentially a guild system, and understanding medieval York means understanding how deeply these institutions penetrated every aspect of daily life. York Minster, or to give it its full name, the Cathedral and Metropolitical Church of St. Peter in York, is the overwhelming architectural fact of medieval York. Construction on the current building began in the early 13th century and continued in phases for over 250 years. It is the largest Gothic cathedral in northern Europe by some measures. Its nave is vast. Its east window is the largest expanse of medieval stained glass in the world. Its chapter house is one of the most perfectly proportioned spaces in English architecture. Walking through York Minster today is not just an aesthetic experience. It is a direct encounter with the aspirations, the faith, the resources, and the craftsmanship of medieval England. Every stone was cut and placed by hand. Every piece of stained glass was painted and fired by craftsmen whose names we mostly don't know. The building took so long to complete that the architectural style changed multiple times. You can trace the shift from early English Gothic at the East End to the decorated style in the chapter house to the perpendicular style of the Great West Towers. And the stained glass. York has more medieval stained glass than any other city in England, more, arguably, than anywhere in Northern Europe. The fact that so much of it survived the Reformation, the Civil War, and the bombing campaigns of the Second World War is something close to a miracle. The Great East Window alone contains over 2,000 individual images, a visual Bible, an encyclopedia of medieval Christian iconography, a window that took one man, John Thornton of Coventry, and his team 3 years to complete between 1405 and 1408. But medieval York was not just a city of faith and commerce. It was also a city of violence, disease, and exclusion. The Jewish community of York, established in the 12th century, was one of the most significant in England. Jewish merchants and moneylenders played a crucial role in the medieval economy. Lending money was forbidden to Christians under canon law, so Jewish financiers filled an essential function in a society that needed credit to function. But they lived in a permanent state of precariousness, dependent on royal protection that was often inadequate and always conditional. In March 1190, that precariousness became catastrophe. Amid a wave of anti-Jewish violence that swept England following the coronation of Richard I, violence partly inflamed by crusading fervor and partly by debtors eager to escape their obligations, a mob turned on the Jewish community of York. The Jews took refuge in the royal castle, the wooden tower that stood where Clifford's Tower now stands. After days of siege, facing certain massacre if they surrendered, the community made a terrible choice. Following the example of Masada, many of them chose to take their own lives rather than fall into the mob's hands. Others tried to surrender and were killed anyway. The wooden tower caught fire. Perhaps 150 people died. It is one of the most horrific events in English medieval history, and York has, in recent decades, worked to commemorate it honestly. There is now a memorial plaque at Clifford's Tower, and every year on the anniversary, a ceremony is held. The massacre of 1190 is a wound in York's history that the city has been slow to acknowledge but cannot ignore. The Black Death reached York in 1349, and its impact was catastrophic. Historians estimate that somewhere between a third and a half of the city's population died in the first outbreak, possibly more. The demographic shock was profound. Labor became scarce. Wages rose. The social order that had seemed fixed and permanent was suddenly unstable. The survivors found themselves in a world that had been reorganized by mass death, and the long-term consequences, economic, social, psychological, played out over generations. York's medieval mystery plays are one of the great surviving monuments of the period. The York Cycle, a series of 48 short dramatic pieces, each performed on a wagon by a different craft guild, depicting the entire Christian story from the creation to the Last Judgment, was performed annually on Corpus Christi Day from at least the 14th century. These were not solemn liturgical performances. They were raucous, funny, earthy, occasionally bawdy, entirely human in their depiction of biblical characters. The shepherds who visit the infant Jesus complain about their wives. The soldiers who crucify Christ crack jokes. The York mystery plays give us a window into medieval popular culture that is as vivid and immediate as anything from the period. The plays were suppressed during the Reformation and revived only in the 20th century. Today they are performed every 4 years in York and draw audiences from around the world, a piece of medieval culture that has proved remarkably durable. By the late 14th century, York's economic dominance was beginning to slip. The wool trade was shifting. Cloth manufacture was moving to smaller West Yorkshire towns like Halifax and Leeds that could offer cheaper labor and water power. London was consolidating its grip on national commerce. York remained important, but the trajectory was changing, and the upheavals of the 15th century would change it further. The 15th century opened with York deeply embedded in the political struggles of the age, most dramatically, the Wars of the Roses, that long dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York that tore England apart between 1455 and 1485. Here's something worth pausing on. The House of York, the dynasty whose symbol was the white rose, was named for this city. The first Duke of York, whose title gave the dynasty its name, held lands centered on Yorkshire. When the Yorkists fought the Lancastrians for the English crown, York the city was not just a backdrop. It was a symbol, a rallying point, an identity. Richard, Duke of York, father of the future King Edward IV, was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460. His head, famously, was displayed above Micklegate Bar, the great gateway into York from the south, adorned, according to tradition, with a paper crown. A dark joke by the Lancastrians, the man who wanted to be king, given a crown in death. But the Yorkist cause survived him. His son Edward fought back, won a series of decisive battles, and became Edward IV in 1461. The head above Micklegate Bar came down. York the city was now aligned with York the dynasty, and for most of the remaining Wars of the Roses, the North, and York especially, was Yorkist territory. The most famous Yorkist of all, and one of history's most controversial figures, grew up in the north and made it his power base. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would become Richard III, was deeply connected to Yorkshire. He served as the virtual viceroy of the north for his brother Edward IV, based partly at Middleham Castle in the Dales, and was genuinely popular in the region in a way that he never was in the south. When Richard took the throne in 1483, through means that have been debated ever since, and which I will not settle today except to say that the debate is real and the evidence is genuinely contested, the North was largely supportive. When he died at Bosworth in 1485, the civic records of York recorded something striking. The city council noted his death with what appears to be genuine grief, describing him as late mercifully raining upon us, and lamenting that he was piteously slain and murdered, to the great heaviness of this city. That record from the York Civic Archives is one of the most quoted pieces of primary source evidence in the entire Richard III debate, because it suggests that, whatever he did in London, in York he was regarded as a good lord. The Tudor dynasty that replaced Richard, beginning with Henry VII and continuing through the reigns of Henry VII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, transformed England fundamentally, and York was changed with it. The most convulsive of these transformations was the Reformation. Henry VII's break with Rome in the 1530s, driven by his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, had profound consequences for York. The dissolution of the monasteries, Henry's systematic destruction of England's monastic institutions, partly for ideological reasons and partly to seize their enormous wealth, hit York hard. The city had numerous monasteries, friaries, and convents, many of them rich and architecturally significant. St. Mary's Abbey, whose ruins still stand in the museum gardens, was one of the wealthiest Benedictine monasteries in northern England. It was dissolved in 1539. The Reformation provoked fierce resistance in the north, which was more conservative and more attached to traditional Catholic practice than the south. In 1536, a massive popular uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace swept through the north of England, the largest rebellion of the entire Tudor period. The rebels marched under a banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ and demanded the restoration of the monasteries, the dismissal of Henry's Protestant advisors, and a reversal of the religious changes. The rebel army occupied the city. The leader of the rebellion, Robert Aske, was a Yorkshire lawyer of genuine religious conviction. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the North might successfully resist the Reformation. Henry VII handled it with characteristic duplicity. He negotiated, made promises he had no intention of keeping, waited for the rebellion to disperse, and then executed its leaders with savage thoroughness. Robert Aske was hanged in chains from the walls of York Castle and left to die slowly. Hundreds of others were executed across the north. The Reformation proceeded. York Minster survived. It was a cathedral, not a monastery, and it was too important to destroy. But the city's religious landscape was transformed. The monasteries were gone. The chantry chapels, where priests were paid to sing masses for the souls of the dead, were dissolved. The mystery plays, deeply Catholic in their theology, were suppressed. The visual culture of medieval Catholic devotion, the images, the relics, the processions, was systematically removed or destroyed. By the reign of Elizabeth I, York had settled into its new Protestant identity, though the region remained more religiously divided than the south. Yorkshire and the surrounding areas continued to produce Catholic recusants, people who refused to attend Protestant services and maintained their old faith at considerable legal and personal risk. A number of Catholic priests were executed in York during the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods, and several have been canonized as martyrs by the Catholic Church. The 17th century brought the most catastrophic conflict of the entire early modern period, the civil war between King Charles I and Parliament. York was a royalist city. The king himself was there in 1639 and again in 1642, when he effectively set up his court in York after being denied entry to the Tower of London. The city was a major royalist military base and supply centre. In 1644, Parliament's forces, allied with the Scottish Covenanting army that had crossed the border to support them, besieged York. The siege lasted months. The city was bombarded. Food ran short. The royalist garrison, under the Marquess of Newcastle, held out with considerable tenacity. In June 1644, a relieving royalist army, commanded by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, one of the most dashing and controversial cavalry commanders of the age, arrived in Yorkshire. Rather than consolidating and waiting, Rupert immediately offered battle. On July 2, 1644, on Marston Moor, about 7 miles west of York, the largest battle ever fought on English soil took place. The Royalists were decisively defeated. Oliver Cromwell's cavalry, the famous Ironsides, shattered the Royalist horse and turned the tide. Newcastle's northern army was destroyed. York was now untenable, and it surrendered under negotiated terms on July 16. York was fortunate. The surrender terms were relatively generous. There was no sack, no massacre. Parliament's commanders were careful to protect the Minster and other major buildings. But the Royalist cause in the north was finished, and when Charles I was executed in 1649, York, like the rest of England, found itself in the strange new world of the interregnum. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 was greeted with celebration in York, as it was across most of England. The city settled into its new role as a major provincial centre, no longer the second city of England in any meaningful sense, but still significant, still wealthy, still historically resonant, and about to enter one of its most culturally distinctive periods. If there is a period in York's history that is often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic Roman, Viking, and medieval chapters, it is the 18th century, and that would be a mistake, because Georgian York was, in its own way, one of the most fascinating versions of the city, a city that reinvented itself as a center of fashionable society, aristocratic leisure, and cultural sophistication. By the early 18th century, York had made a strategic choice. It could not compete with Leeds, Halifax, and the emerging industrial towns of the West Riding for manufacturing dominance. It could not compete with London for commerce or politics, but it could offer something those places couldn't: history, beauty, a central location in the north, and the social infrastructure needed to attract the gentry and aristocracy of Yorkshire and the surrounding counties. York became what contemporaries called the winter capital of the north, the place where the county families came in the autumn and winter months to socialize, to arrange marriages, to attend the races, to go to the theater, to take part in concerts and assemblies, to see and be seen. The social season centered on the assembly rooms, built in 1731–32 to the designs of Richard Boyle, the 3rd Earl of Burlington, one of the great patrons of Palladian architecture in England. Burlington was applying the architectural principles he had absorbed during his grand tour of Italy, the same principles that would produce his own Chiswick House near London. The York Assembly Rooms were one of the finest Palladian buildings in England, a space of genuine architectural distinction that could hold hundreds of people for balls, card parties, and concerts. The races were a central institution of Georgian York. Horse racing had been established at York since at least the 17th century, but it was in the Georgian period that the Knavesmire, the racecourse to the south of the city, became one of the premier racing venues in England. The Eber Handicap, established in 1843, would eventually become one of the most prestigious flat races in the country. But the culture of racing in York, the social rituals surrounding it, the betting, the display, was fully formed in the 18th century. Newspapers flourished. York had its own newspaper, the York Courant, founded in 1725, which covered local and national news and served the wider Yorkshire reading public. The coffee houses where men gathered to read newspapers, discuss politics, and conduct business were as much a feature of Georgian York as of London. The theatre was another pillar of Georgian cultural life. York's Theatre Royal, which still operates today on St. Leonard's Place, was established in the 18th century and was the hub of the northern theatrical circuit. Actors who couldn't make it in London came to York. Actors who made it in York often progressed to London. The theatrical network connecting provincial cities like York, Leeds, Hull, and Newcastle was a genuinely important cultural infrastructure, and York was at its center. Georgian York also produced some remarkable individual figures. John Carr, universally known as Carr of York, was the dominant architect of the north of England in the second half of the 18th century. Born in Horbury, trained as a mason, he rose to become the most sought-after country house architect in Yorkshire and beyond, designing Harewood House, Basildon Park, and dozens of other major buildings. He served as Lord Mayor of York twice and left the city a substantial bequest that funded charitable projects for generations. The physical fabric of Georgian York is still very much present. The elegant townhouses that line Micklegate, the streets around the Minster, the terraces of Bootham, these are predominantly 18th century buildings, their brick facades and sash windows conveying the taste for order, proportion, and quiet prosperity that define the Georgian aesthetic. But Georgian York was not all assembly balls and race meetings. The city had its poverty, its crime, its grim institutional realities. The York Castle complex, centered on the medieval tower that became known as Clifford's Tower, was used as a prison throughout this period. public executions took place at the Tyburn Gallows on the Knavesmire, the same ground where the horses now race, and drew enormous crowds. Dick Turpin, the highwayman who had become famous through William Harrison Ainsworth's romanticized novel, was hanged at York in 1739. His real story was considerably less glamorous than the legend. He was a violent criminal, not a dashing rogue, but his execution drew a huge crowd, and his grave in the churchyard of St. George's became a site of morbid pilgrimage. The Georgian period also saw serious engagement with York's own history. The antiquarian movement, a passion for investigating and documenting the past, took root in the 18th century, and York was rich material. Men like Francis Drake, whose Eboracum, published in 1736, was the first substantial history of York, began the systematic study of the city's Roman, medieval, and early modern past. The Yorkshire Philosophical Society, founded in 1822, would eventually establish the Yorkshire Museum, one of the finest regional museums in England, in the Museum Gardens, adjacent to the ruins of St. Mary's Abbey. Georgian York was a city in balance, maintaining its dignity and historical weight while adapting to the realities of a world in which industrial capitalism was beginning to transform everything around it. That transformation was about to accelerate enormously. On May 29, 1839, the first train pulled into York. The York and North Midland Railway, engineered by George Hudson, the man who would briefly become the most powerful railway promoter in England, connected York to the national network, and nothing was ever the same again. The railway didn't just change how people traveled. It changed the city's economy, its geography, its population, its social structure, and its sense of its own identity. York went from being a genteel, somewhat sleepy county town, pleasant, historically distinguished, but economically stagnant, to one of the most important railway centers in England. George Hudson is one of the most fascinating figures in Victorian York's history, and one of the most complex. Born the son of a small farmer in the East Riding of Yorkshire, he came to York as a young man, married well, inherited money, and channeled his extraordinary energy and ambition into the emerging railway mania of the 1830s and 1840s. He consolidated small railway companies, built new lines, promoted York as a railway hub, served as Lord Mayor 3 times, and became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England. At the height of his power, Hudson controlled over 1,000 miles of railway, roughly a third of the entire British network. He was called the Railway King, and he cultivated relationships with the great and powerful of the age, including the Duke of Wellington and Prince Albert. His house in Monkgate, York, was the center of a social whirl that rivaled anything the city had seen in its Georgian heyday. Then in 1849 it collapsed. Investigations revealed that Hudson had been manipulating accounts, paying dividends out of capital, and enriching himself through fraudulent share transactions. He was ruined financially, socially, politically. He fled to the continent to escape his creditors and died in relative obscurity in 1871. But Hudson's legacy endured. The railway infrastructure he had built was real, whatever the means by which he had financed it. York's position as a major railway junction, on the main line between London and Edinburgh, with connections spreading across Yorkshire, was established and couldn't be undone by his personal disgrace. The railway created jobs, thousands of them. The carriage works, where railway carriages were built and maintained, became one of the city's largest employers. The engine sheds, the goods yards, the signal boxes, all of this industrial infrastructure brought a new working class into York, people who had nothing to do with the aristocratic social world of the assembly rooms and the races, who lived in the rows of terraced houses that began to spread across previously rural parts of the city. The population grew dramatically. York had perhaps 16,000 people at the beginning of the 19th century. By 1901, it had over 70,000. The physical city expanded to accommodate them: new suburbs, new churches, new schools, new parks. The Victorian period also brought the confectionery industry to York, and this is a chapter in the city's history that has genuine global significance. 2 Quaker families, the Rountrees and the Terrys, established chocolate and confectionery businesses in York that would become internationally famous. Joseph Rowntree built not just a company but a social vision. The model village of New Earswick, just north of York, designed to provide decent housing, community facilities, and green space for his workers, was one of the most significant experiments in social housing of the Victorian and Edwardian periods. Rowntree's fruit pastilles, Kit Kat, Quality Street, Arrow, Smarties, all of these products that have been eaten by hundreds of millions of people around the world originated in York. The connection between a northern English city and global confectionery culture is one of those surprising historical facts that reveals how particular local conditions, Quaker values emphasizing social responsibility, the railway connections that enabled mass distribution, the cheap sugar that Victorian trade made available, can combine to produce something with genuinely worldwide impact. Victorian York also engaged seriously with its own history. The Yorkshire Museum, opened in 1830, began collecting and displaying the archaeological remains that were being uncovered as the city built and rebuilt. The Roman artifacts, the Viking finds, the medieval religious art, all began to be systematically preserved and studied rather than simply discarded. York Minster, meanwhile, suffered a series of disasters in the 19th century that nearly destroyed it. In 1829, a deranged man named Jonathan Martin, who believed the clergy of the Minster were agents of the devil, set fire to the choir. The damage was severe. In 1840, another fire destroyed the south transept roof. Both times, the Minster was repaired and restored, with Victorian architects and craftsmen working to preserve and reinstate the medieval fabric, sometimes well, sometimes in ways that later scholars would criticize, but always with genuine commitment to saving the building. By the end of the Victorian period, York was a city that contained multitudes. The ancient walls still stood, the Minster still dominated the skyline, but around it and beneath it, a modern industrial city had grown up, a city of railway workers and chocolate factory employees, of terrace streets and Victorian churches, of a working class that was beginning slowly to find its political voice. The 20th century would bring new challenges, new changes, and in one crucial week in the summer of 1942, a brush with destruction that could have erased much of what had been built over 2,000 years. The 20th century opened quietly for York. The Edwardian period, the brief, golden reign of Edward VII from 1901 to 1910, was one of relative prosperity and social confidence, though beneath the surface the forces that would tear the world apart were already gathering. The First World War reached York in ways both direct and indirect. The city was an important military base. Regiments were mustered and trained here. Soldiers passed through on their way to the Western Front. York's hospitals treated the wounded. The names of the fallen fill the war memorials in churches, schools, and public spaces across the city. But the war's most dramatic direct impact on York came on the night of May 2nd to 3rd, 1916, when a German Zeppelin, one of the massive airships that Germany used to bomb British cities in the early years of the war, dropped bombs on the city. 9 people were killed. It was a shocking moment, the first time in history that York had been attacked from the air. The interwar years were difficult. The 1920s brought economic uncertainty. The 1930s brought the Depression, which hit the railway industry particularly hard. York's working class, dependent on the carriage works and related industries, suffered significant unemployment. Seabohm Rowntree, son of Joseph Rowntree, and one of the pioneers of social science research, published his landmark studies of poverty in York in 1901 and again in 1936, documenting with meticulous statistical rigor the extent and causes of poverty in the city. His work was enormously influential on British social policy and helped lay the intellectual groundwork for the welfare state that Labour would build after 1945. The Second World War brought York's most terrifying night. On April 28, 1942, German bombers attacked the city in what became known as a Baedeker raid, a German strategy of bombing British cities of cultural and historical significance, rather than purely military or industrial targets, as retaliation for RAF bombing of German historic cities. York was targeted precisely because of its history, its Minster, its famous medieval character. The raid killed 92 people, destroyed or badly damaged over 9,000 buildings, and left parts of the city in ruins. But by extraordinary fortune, or, depending on your perspective, extraordinary incompetence by the German bombers, York Minster survived almost entirely unscathed. A few incendiary devices landed nearby, but the great cathedral stood. The rebuilding of post-war York was a process that, like in many British cities, involved both thoughtful preservation and some decisions that later generations would deeply regret. Several historic buildings that had survived everything from the Vikings to the Blitz were demolished in the 1950s and 1960s to make way for new roads and development. The city did not suffer as badly as some. Manchester, for instance, lost far more of its Victorian fabric, but losses were made that are now mourned. The turning point came in the late 1960s and 1970s, with the publication of the Escher Report, a study commissioned to guide the future development of York that recommended, radically for its time, that the city's historic character should be the basis of its economic and civic future rather than an obstacle to modernization. York should be preserved and celebrated, not rebuilt to accommodate more cars. That philosophy, which now seems obviously correct but was genuinely contested at the time, shaped the modern city. The walls were maintained. The shambles was preserved rather than cleared. Historic buildings were protected. Tourism was promoted as a major economic sector. And tourism came. York became one of the most visited cities in England, attracting millions of visitors every year, drawn by the Minster, the walls, the Viking heritage, the railway museum, the confectionery history, the medieval streets. The National Railway Museum, opened in York in 1975, is the largest railway museum in the world and one of the most visited museums in the country, a fitting tribute to the city that was remade by the railway revolution. The Jorvik Viking Center, opened in 1984, was a landmark in the presentation of archaeology to the public. Using the finds from the Coppergate excavation, it created an immersive reconstruction of Viking Age York that brought the past to life in a way that academic publication alone could never do. Controversial in some quarters, purists worried about the line between education and entertainment. It proved immensely popular and influenced the design of heritage attractions around the world. York Minster faced its most recent crisis in 1984, when lightning struck the south transept during a thunderstorm on the night of July 9th and started a fire that destroyed the roof and severely damaged the interior. The rose window, a masterpiece of medieval glazing, was shattered into over 40,000 pieces. In an extraordinary conservation effort, it was painstakingly restored, piece by piece, over the following years. Some, with a mixture of humor and genuine theological speculation, noted that the lightning strike came just 3 days after the controversial consecration of David Jenkins as Bishop of Durham in the Minster. Jenkins had made some unorthodox theological statements about the resurrection, and the timing of the fire was too much for some to attribute to coincidence. The Minster authorities quietly noted that lightning strikes were a meteorological rather than a divine phenomenon. The late 20th and early 21st century brought new pressures and new conversations. York's relationship with tourism grew complex. The city needed the economic activity that millions of visitors brought, but the sheer volume of people and the rising house prices that came with the city's desirability created real problems for residents. The debate about how to manage heritage tourism without destroying the living community it is built on is one that York has not fully resolved and probably never will. The University of York, founded in 1963, brought a new dimension to the city's identity. One of the new universities of the 1960s, designed with a distinctive campus around an artificial lake, it became one of the leading research universities in the country and introduced a large student population whose presence shaped the city's culture, politics, and economy. Demographically, York became more diverse in the late 20th century, though it remains less ethnically diverse than many other British cities of comparable size. The conversations about diversity, inclusion, and the relationship between a city's past and its present population are ones that York, like every British city, is navigating in real time. The Shambles Market, the city's food market, was reinvented as a popular destination. The independent shops that lined the Shambles itself became a symbol of the kind of retail experience that global e-commerce couldn't replicate. The food and drink scene, restaurants, craft breweries, independent coffee shops, became part of York's contemporary identity alongside its historical ones. York's chocolate heritage took a complicated turn. Rowntree's was acquired by Nestlé in 1988, and the site of the original factory was eventually redeveloped. Terry's was acquired by a series of owners, and the York factory closed in 2005, with production moved abroad. The loss of the Terry's factory, in particular the closure of the facility that had made the famous Terry's chocolate orange, was mourned by many Yorkers as the end of an era. The factory building itself was converted into luxury apartments. In 2013, something happened that made international headlines and brought York's deep historical connections to national attention. During construction work in a Leicester car park, apparently unremarkable circumstances, archaeologists discovered a skeleton. DNA analysis, combined with historical and genealogical research, confirmed what became one of the most extraordinary archaeological stories of modern times. The skeleton was that of King Richard III, killed at Bosworth in 1485. York responded with proprietorial emotion. This was their king, the man whose death the city council had lamented in those famous words from the civic records. There was a genuine debate, with legal and political dimensions, about where Richard should be reinterred. Leicester, where he was found, ultimately won the argument, and Richard was reburied in Leicester Cathedral in 2015. But York's attachment to his memory was very real, and the Richard III Society, an organization devoted to rehabilitating his historical reputation, has always had a strong base in Yorkshire. Today, York stands as one of the most historically layered cities in Europe. Walk any 100 meters through the city center, and you will pass over Roman foundations, through Viking street patterns, under Norman stonework, past medieval guild halls, Georgian terraces, Victorian railway architecture, and the glass and steel of contemporary development. The city is a palimpsest, a document written over and over again, in which every layer shows through the ones above it. The walls still stand. After nearly 2,000 years in one form or another, York is still a walled city. You can walk the entire circuit, almost 3 miles on top of those walls, looking down into gardens and streets and the backs of houses, looking up at the Minster towers, looking out toward the Vale of York, where the Romans first arrived with their legions and their ambition. And underneath it all, literally underneath, because the ground level of Roman Eboracum lies 4 or 5 meters below modern street level, the earliest layers of the city continue to yield their secrets. Every major construction project in York is a potential archaeological event. The city's soil is so saturated with history that it is effectively a continuous excavation in progress. From Eboracum to Jorvik, from the seat of emperors to the capital of a Viking kingdom, from the second city of medieval England to a Georgian assembly city to a Victorian railway hub to a 21st century heritage destination, York has never stopped being significant. It has reinvented itself repeatedly, absorbed conquerors and been transformed by them, survived fires and plagues and sieges and wars, and emerged each time with its identity not erased but deepened. That is the extraordinary thing about York. Its history is not a fixed monument. It is a living argument between past and present, between preservation and change, between the weight of 2,000 years and the demands of the people who live here now. That argument will go on long after the current generation of residents and visitors has passed, and the city will be something different again, carrying all of this, and more, into a future we can't yet imagine. That is the entire history of York, and if this video has given you even a fraction of the awe that this city deserves, please hit that subscribe button right now. We cover the great stories that history books gloss over, the mystery beneath the surface, the human drama that never makes it into the textbooks. Drop a comment below, tell me which era of York surprised you the most, which chapter you want me to expand into its own dedicated video, which city you think I should cover next. Your comments genuinely shape what this channel produces, and I read every single one. If you've been watching for a while and you haven't subscribed yet, this is your moment. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and join the community that believes history is the greatest story ever told. I'll see you in the next one.